So just a little introduction to the incredibly complex conflict of Darfur. Sudan has a number of civil wars. There was the North-South Civil War, which went off and on for 50 years, and you can see South Sudan and Khartoum, when you've got the oil fields on the border there. And as that conflict was coming to a close, as people realized that if they made peace, then everyone would be better off because they could extract the oil. Well, the Darfuris, who are over on the left as you look at the map, said, hey, what about us? We're marginalized too. But the problem was this didn't fit the international agenda of countries like the US and the UK, particularly the US, who wanted a big result internationally to have a peace agreement in Sudan. So international pressure was just to have an agreement between Sudan and South Sudan and not to complicate things by bringing in the Darfuris or other marginalized group in Sudan. So what happened was that the Darfuris said, well, stuff this. They said, well, if you're not going to invite us to the table, we're going to have a rebellion too. And in 2003, they started attacking government installations in Darfur. Now, what the government then couldn't do was send in the army in a big way to Darfur. I mean, apart from anything else, there were rather a lot of Darfuris in the army who had been fighting against the south. So what the government did, as it has done kind of historically, and also kind of colonial governments have done, is to use proxy militia. And Darfur was right for that, because as we'll see, there was a genuine competition between different land users. Some of the people who migrate and some of the people who farm had a growing competition, and it was very easy just to arm one side of that and let quite literally all hell break loose. And that's what happened. 300,000 killed, 2 million displaced out of a population of 8 million. So just massive devastation. This is 2003 to 2005. And what I'm going to be looking at is, well, what does this mean at the local level with respect to peace building? If people are fighting, and part of the fight is over control of land and natural resources, but that needs to be put in the context of a civil war, which is about the political marginalization of Darfur, then you've got two wars going on at the same time. How do you bring peace in that context, and what does that actually mean? And just to kind of draw that out, you're able to, there should be a little video clip here. Oh, great, we've got that. Just to draw that out, a little bit of background. On the right here, you can see a map of Darfur, and these are all different ethnic groups. In Darfur, they refer to themselves as tribes, and so I'll use that term. Some of them are Arab, and a lot of those people migrate, and some of them are less Arab. There's not a fine line. It's gradations, and actually people switch from one to the other. And then, but just to kind of bring it home, at the top you've got the Zagawa, and you may or may not remember the name Abdulrahman Haroun, who was, I think, extraordinary achievement of being the first person to walk through the Channel Tunnel while there were live trains going through it and survive. Just recently, he was one of these kind of famous migrants, but this is a human face on it, and he's from Zagar in the north of Darfur. So anyway, but what is it with this migration? And this is part of how we need to kind of change mindset and understand a different relational context in which we're working. And this map up here shows the vegetation changes over the course of the year. And the Sahel means shore in Arabic, and you can see that the vegetation is just changing massively. So everything is moving in terms of whether it's barren desert in the dry season or lush green. So here we've got camel migrants, and they're in a lush green area. But you go back to that spot 4 months later, it'll be completely barren and dusty. So actually, there's very few people I suggest, and I do contact me if in the break if this is an overgeneralization, who really understand a migratory lifestyle. I suggest the people in Europe who understand it best are the Sami from the north of Norway, who migrate over the course of the year over 600 or more kilometres, as do these camel herders. Or perhaps maybe you grow up in a traveller community and you migrate from one place to another, maybe working on a fairground. But basically you are this group of people who don't have a set home. I mean, I referred to my roots in Cambridge, but you have patterns of which you migrate. Now, well, that's well and good to say, okay, look, well, you've got a small bunch of people, but in Sudan, you've got 9 million out of 39 million are these migratory people. So you've got to have a fundamentally different set of relationships, because apart from anything else, you don't have directness, because most of the time you're on the move. And then you lose directness, you also lose multiplexity, because people who have power just don't understand these livelihoods. And this is part of our problem with trying to understand how we should respond to the Eritreans and the Chadians and the Sudanese who are now migrating, is we don't really have a context to understand this. Now, just to think a little bit more about, actually, well, what are the kind of changes that they're facing? And this is an area where you've got cattle migrants, but you've also got kind of rain-fed agriculture going on here. And on the left is a map from 1973, and on the right from the year 2000, and it's about 100 square kilometres. So it's about 50. Sorry, forgive me. It's 50 kilometres by 50 kilometres. These maps. And in 1973, the pale green is rangeland, the pink is rain-fed agriculture, and the blue is ephemeral rivers, and the green is forestry. Now, if you were a cattle migrant in 1973, and you wanted to go from the south to the north of this picture and back, it'd be very easy to pick your way, and maybe you would know the sheikhs, the village chiefs, and you would be able to negotiate your passage through there. But in 2000, you would not know everyone on the route, and you would have to have a different system of governance in order to find your way through that, or you may end up with clashes as your cattle ate some of the vegetable gardens or so on. Now, this is the transition which is taking place across the Sahel, and it needs a transition in governance. Now, before we kind of think, okay, well, that's governance in Sahel, actually we are facing, and have faced over the last few years, a change in the interface of our traditional governance system and our formal governance system, exactly the same, in terms of no longer any live peers. Potentially we might become two countries where we're one, or are we actually four anyway? In terms of the separation of Scotland. So I think we shouldn't be thinking in terms of other countries having these big changes and ours being static in a kind of end of history type argument, but it's all a matter of the nature of the politics by which change happens according to the circumstances, and that I think is key, is functional politics that don't slip over into violence. Because actually it may be the violence is the thing which brings the change, which should have happened a long time ago. So this is the kind of complexity taking place. Now, on the right, you've got a picture of a very nicely organised set of camels drinking from a water point, and you can see effectively that's good governance. On the left, at the top, you can see that these trees have been ringed. Now, that would never have happened before the conflict, but during the conflict, traditional environmental governance has broken down, and so we're getting the destruction of these trees. So you can think of conflict, or you can think of crises as traumatic accelerated transitions, like a tectonic shift taking place. And the bottom, on the left, you've got, this is the main reservoir for the largest town in Darfur. It's 5 million metre cubed reservoir, but it's 4 million metre cubed of silt in it. So who is going to clear out that 4 million metre cubed of silt? What is going to be the government role? And if the government hasn't got the funds, well, how is that all going to be managed? So you can see then in talking about natural resources, we've got to talk about the relationships of government to bring those the management of these issues. Now, I don't know how many saw the news yesterday, but it came very well after Bob White's talk. An extraordinary earthquake happened just a few hours after Bob gave his talk. 8.4 on the Richter scale, and a tsunami of 4.7 meters high. And yesterday, we heard there were only 10 fatalities. So this is a bigger earthquake than the Nepal earthquake, with a tiny, tiny fraction of the fatalities. I mean, obviously there are going to be more reported, but basically Chile got it right. They were able to kind of withdraw. They had the systems. So talking in terms of, I was asked to talk on the subject of resilience, and this is DFID's definition of resilience is the ability of countries, communities and households to manage change by maintaining or transforming living standards in the face of shocks or stresses such as earthquakes, drought or violent conflict without compromising their long-term prospects. So we can see that the organisation that Chile had enabled them to be resilient. What does resilience look like for the Sahelian pastoralists? It's not a matter of an early warning system, although that's part of it in terms of the drought. It's actually this longer-term transition without spilling over into conflict. And I'm just going to take a few minutes to say some of the ways that the work that I was involved with, we tried to address that. And we had this framework that was about relationships, that peace building at the local level was trying to get community to communities to cooperate. Now, most of that is done by tribal chiefs and the negotiations which take place there. But we're thinking in terms of longer term, you've got to bring government into this because it's a Ministry of Agriculture's role to allocate land in the longer run, or to manage land and to manage water resources. So governance, you've got to restore the relationship between communities and government if you're going to enable this transition. But then we find that different parts of government are taking different approaches, which made the comparison between Darfur and the UK very, very clear, kind of hearing about some of the work the Relationship Foundation doing about fragmented approach for government and the fatalities that we have had as a result of that. Well, it's the same in Darfur. And then the role of civil society organisations, within that. So whilst it's obviously not this kind of rectangular, this angular kind of network framework, there is a network of relationships which makes up society and makes up governance. And we can look at what that actually means and work out, well, how are we going to have a transition whereby there's an inclusive voice for the marginalised pastoralists and the farmers who have now lost their farms because the marginalised pastoralists were given all the guns. Now, one of the things that we did on this was we worked on community-based approaches. If you can get a village together and have a dialogue process, not only are you able to address some of the local tensions over natural resources, but also you're enabled that village to say with clarity their voice against maybe the government or something. So you're also addressing a vertical relationship as well as a horizontal relationship, and it involves lots of this kind of mapping work done on the bottom right, we can see. Now, a project which we then kind of moved on to doing was doing that kind of community-based natural resource management in lots of different places along a river, and this is the river on the left here, and then building that network of village development committees together. But then, of course, it's got to fit in with government. And on the top right, I mean, this was one of the treats of the programme. You've got to take the smooth with the rough because there's not much of it. I had 2 trips to look at the water management in South Africa, and here we are in the South African winelands with the Minister of Agriculture from South Darfur, so from a pastoralist background. In the white suit is the Federal Undersecretary of Irrigation and Water Resources, so representing central government. And on the left is a gentleman who was part of the rebel movements and joined the Darfur Regional Authority. So we've got this group of people working out, having that debate, not talking technically, but effectively it's the real politics of how is Darfur going to interact amongst itself and with government after the conflict. This is an example of some of the research work done by our colleagues at Tufts University. So if you think that if I painted the pastoralists as outsiders socially, but then they had the opportunity to get the guns, and some of them became the notorious Janjaweed, but they had political aspirations that weren't being articulated. So Tufts and UNEP, we worked with the tribal groups to work out what is happening to the livelihoods of the camel herders. And quite shocking, we can see that the changes in livelihoods, for example, before the conflict they were doing more with livestock and agriculture, but then they shifted into firewood collection. But this is a livelihood that used to be the livelihood of the farmers who they've displaced. So there's a direct competition in terms of the control of natural resources. They've won out by the war. So how does that get resolved at the end when the displaced people are supposed to come back? And lower down we find that, this group have moved out of livestock and they've joined the militia. So actually we can then say, look, what is the end game for the Darfur conflict? Unless we can enable these pastoralists to resolve these tensions and to develop their livelihood. But therefore you can see we're providing multiplexity with this relationship. But what was key in this was we didn't just do this study and say, here you go, chaps, it's like this. But having done that first study, we had credibility and were then able to sit down with the Council of Development of Nomads. This is the political wing of some of these groups. So a little bit like the role of Sinn Féin to the Republican community in the IRA at an earlier stage. And we were able to do a study that had the Council of Development of Nomads and the Ministry of Livestock working together. And there was a great moment where they were all sitting round and said, right, we've got to bring, for the next study, we've got to bring in tagging equipment to track the livestock. Whoops, who's going to talk to national security about bringing in this sensitive electronic equipment? This is the kind of challenge of working in Sudan where you've got a very strong national security. And it was very interesting how that process of trying to work out this complex problem and then going ahead and delivering on the study, and that's this study on the right, built a relationship which came through. Now, we were at the time funded by DFID, and there was the massive cutback on aid funding in this country. So we had to produce a metric for DFID which said, look, all this sitting around doing workshops and doing studies has some good and we can explain it. And basically we ended up with developing a relational pathway that at an early stage, two groups meet, you will establish directness, but then you've got to work out, is there a reason for us to collaborate? And so then you work out, is there commonality? But then you say, is it going to be fair? And so then you would look at parity, and then you could effectively, you set up a contract at that stage and say, yes, we're going to do this, and the results are going to be shared in that way. And you've got to step 3, and then you actually do the thing together. And that is a game changer because you set a precedent of collaborating. And then after that, you might then move on to doing the same thing again, doing another study or setting something up that reflects your relationship which you've now established. And so what ended up after the second of these studies is there's now a pastoralist research forum which has these key different political groups in Darfur from Sudan meeting every 4 months in order to then decide kind of a joint agenda. And that is a way of establishing multiplexity and directness in that relationship between pastoralists and the rest of the community. So just to conclude then, in terms of what the massive challenge is, as I see it, with respect to the Sahel. So this map at the bottom is the coefficient of variation of the maximum vegetation each year. And basically it's saying, look, where is this very highly variable area on vegetation? And you can see it's right across the Sahel and round into the Horn of Africa. But at the same time, you can see where the population growth is highest. And again, the Sahel is absolutely critical to this. So what we've got in the Sahel is we've got these big tectonic shifts in population size, in forms of governance, and some of it spilling over to conflict, and some of them, like Abdulrahman, are deciding, look, my only real solution is to go up to Libya and then end up kind of doing something so risky as walking through the Channel Tunnel. Now, what then we're faced with is on the right, you can see high-level politics in terms of a peace agreement between the Darfuris and the government of Sudan. But on the lower right, this is a negotiation in the mountains of Darfur, enabling livestock to be traded across a line of a conflict. So you've got that local level of real political contestation, and you've got a slightly extracted kind of thing sitting above it. And how do we make the connection so that, you know, the real politics and the real adaptation of our governance systems, the real adaptation of our networks of relationships, is reflected in the bigger picture?